Уважаемые коллеги, добрый день. Очень рады представить вам господина Бернта Финке, генерального консула Федеративной Республики Германии в Новосибирске. Он сегодня выступит перед вами с исключительно интересной лекцией. На самом деле можно было две темы. Мы выбрали вот эту, это наш выбор. Ну, вы уж нас простите, в общем-то, посовещались с деканами, заместителями деканов и с небольшим количеством студентов. Это тема дипломатия в эпоху хаоса. Мы считаем, что она чрезвычайно постмодернистская и очень актуальна для нас. Господин Финке дипломат, имеющий очень длительный послужной список, длинный. Он работал в разных странах, он работал в Соединенных Штатах, он работал в Африке, он работает сейчас здесь. То есть он очень хорошо представляет себе, что такое дипломатическая профессия, со всеми ее обертонами и подводными камнями. Лекция будет длиться час и потом 15 минут на вопросы. На английском языке без перерыва. Вопросы желательно тоже задавать на английском или на немецком языке. Спасибо.
Whoops. So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks a lot for the invitation to be here at the State University again. I arrived in Siberia early December, so 5 months ago. It's already my third visit to Novosibirsk and to Tomsk, my third visit to the university. So you can see I really like it here. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity and the initiative to discuss with you today about my profession, diplomacy, about the challenges it faces, and about the international environment in which we are working. As you mentioned, the subject was your choice. When I prepared for the lecture today, I thought it would have been better if they picked the other one, because it's quite a complicated issue we are talking about. But I try to give you an overview about the changes of diplomacy in what we call today a world of disorder. For the record, I'd like to state that my observations are personal observations. So I talk to you as a professional diplomat, not as the Consul General, because I don't know if all the observations I'm going to share with you are being shared by my government in Berlin. As you mentioned, I've been posted to various countries. My first posting after attending diplomatic school was in New York, and then I moved on to Germany again, then from Germany to St. Petersburg. 20 years ago, 23 years ago, from St. Petersburg to Rome, from Rome to Berlin, from Berlin to Kosovo, where I worked for the United Nations 1 year, then back to Rome, back to Berlin. Then I was posted in Africa, in Zambia, for 4 years, from Zambia to Latin America, El Salvador, and now since December last year, I'm here in Novosibirsk as Consul General for the whole of Siberia and the Russian Far East. During my diplomatic career, which now lasts for more than 30 years, I've covered all the topics which you are dealing with in diplomacy. So political affairs, economic affairs, cultural affairs, legal affairs, press affairs, protocol issues. So everything that happens, I've been dealing with. We call it in Germany the system of generalists. And I've worked on bilateral relations and also on multilateral relations, mostly within the framework of the United Nations and the European Union in Brussels. Both components of my talk, diplomacy and the state of international order, they generate a lot of academic interest. There are right now many research projects and studying, dealing with these sets of issues. What is the future of diplomacy? What is the current state of affairs as far as the international community of states is concerned? But the question of the future of diplomacy, in our so-called world of disorder, is of course not only of academic interests. For me as a professional diplomat, it is of great personal relevance, because it relates to how and under what conditions I can practice my profession. But diplomacy is not only important for diplomats, it is important for all of us, for you as well. Diplomacy matters because the relations between states are fundamental to many, many aspects of our lives. They determine whether we live in peace or go to war as nations, whether our states form association with other states to promote trade, tourism, human rights, academic exchange, education, scientific cooperation, or protect the environment. So these ever-changing pattern of relations between states, from conflict to cooperation, sometimes back to conflict, is guided by kind of elaborated practice of global diplomacy. And therefore, we all should have an interest in how our state relates to other states through a long-established set of diplomatic components and practices. Some of them are very visible. This is when I talk about embassies and ambassadors, consulates and consuls, the issue of diplomatic communities, of course, and the ceremony of presenting your credentials to the head of state when you become an ambassador. The execution of démarches, negotiations, and occasionally, and this is an issue for our relations with Russia quite often in the past months, is the expulsion of diplomats from sovereign states. So my lecture implies the quite obvious thesis that the current state of international order, which now is more often described as an international disorder, affects the way diplomacy is conducted. And therefore, I first would like to address the reference points which underlie the topic. First, it is about the question, what is the benchmark that makes us think that the current state of world is in disorder? And secondly, it is about the question, what are the tasks of diplomacy that may be subject to changes? What I find very interesting is that what makes the world seem so disorderly today is that we compare it with international order in the days of the East-West conflict. That is, with the international order that emerged after the Second World War and left its marks on international affairs until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And as many of you may know, the main features of this order were the division of the world, of states in two parts, which we described as bipolarity, under the leadership of two superpowers, USA and the Soviet Union. Then the containment or control of conflicts on a global basis by these pact superpowers. The view of the international order through the lenses of ideology, liberalism versus communism or socialism. And then a decade-long preservation of the status quo through mutual assured nuclear deterrence. And later on, a commitment to peaceful coexistence. So consequently, we were living through a relatively long period with a high degree of stability, predictability, and that is order. Political scientists have characterized the behavior of actors during the Cold War with reference to models of game theory as a zero-sum game in which gains or advantages of the other sides were interpreted as mirror image losses or disadvantages for one's own side. And this also means that the international order was not only perceived as relatively stable and calculable, but was also characterized by a very high degree of mistrust between the blocs. And it is ironic that many diplomats, politicians, academics, students like myself, I studied political science and international law in the 1980s, so that all those who lived through this area view the structure of the international order of that time with a touch of nostalgia or even melancholy. Back then, we characterized the international order with keywords like balance of terror, or mutual assured destruction. But today, it often evokes memories of stability and clarity. And today, it is not the balance of terror that, with hindsight, is frightening, but the current state of world affairs, which is perceived precisely as a world in disorder, with a high degree of unpredictability and faced with unprecedented challenges. So if the post-war bipolar order serves as a benchmark for today's talk of the world coming out of joint, what are the main features and main developments that shape the current international order? I cannot go into detail on all aspects of the current international order in the context of this lecture. I only would like to mention the challenges posed to the international community by international terrorism, transnational organized crime, climate change, or by what we have seen over the past decade, an unprecedented refugee and migration crisis. But in more detail, I will discuss a number of aspects that are of particular development importance for the way we conduct diplomacy. And point number one, of course, concerns the change from a bipolar to a multipolar international order. After the end of the East-West conflict, the global arena now presents itself to diplomacy as a multipolar world. And multipolarity is kind of a paradigm of international politics in the 21st century. And the dominance of the bipolar international order by the United States and the Soviet Union has been replaced now by an order in which, with varying degrees of success, a whole range of actors lay claim to shaping it. These include, in particular, the United States, Russia, China, the European Union, and, to a lesser degree, India and Brazil. And as far as global power shifts in the world are concerned, the following contours are currently particularly evident. The United States, without doubt, remains the strongest power militarily, but its political influence, however, has declined under the America First policy begun by President Trump. How the United States will position itself under President Biden cannot yet definitely be seen, but initial steps point to numerous course corrections that will make the United States politically, from a German perspective, again part of the West. China is rising economically at a pace completely unprecedented in history. Militarily, China is now second only to the United States, and its political influence has global dimensions. When I served in Africa or Latin America, I could see it, how China managed to sort of colonialize many regions of these continents. And Russia has a claim to be a Euro-Asian great power and to act on equal footing with the United States and China. But the challenge we see is that this political claim is not backed up economically. When we look at Russia's gross domestic product, it ranks only on number 11 among the world's major economies, roughly on par with countries like Spain and Brazil. And the only area where Russia can compete with the United States is nuclear weapons. And Russia's status as a great power is based primarily on this. And on this status, to be a permanent member of the Security Council in New York. And the European Union is also claiming to be a shaping power, but its ability to act in foreign policy lags far behind its economic power. Yeah, even though the European Union was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012 for its international engagement. Now, and at present, as many of you know, the European Union is primarily preoccupied with internal challenges and, of course, weakened by the exit of the United Kingdom. The second fundamental change in the international order concerns what we call the aspect of stakeholder diversity. The term international community no longer refers only to states, but to numerous new actors who act across borders and in some cases now have global influence and power resources and thus intervene in diplomatic activities that were formerly the prerogative of states and their representatives, the diplomats. And these are in many countries domestic institutions, such as ministries or federal states, whose tasks extend into foreign policy, international organizations, of course, and more so, transnationally active companies and non-governmental organizations that also exert considerable international influence. Now, we live in an area marked by multiple spheres of authority, whose agents are not constrained by domestic arenas, but whose interests are pursued in whatever policy arenas are appropriate to the achievement of their objectives. Google, for instance, as far as global companies are concerned, or Amnesty International for the NGO field, they are really global players. Another very worrying phenomenon that has emerged since the end of the East-West conflict is the rapid increase in fragile, disintegrating, or failed states. And this refers to states that are unable to perform the core functions of statehood, above all security and welfare, or can do so only to a limited extent. And in the extreme case of state collapses, they become a threat to regional and international security. The prime example of a collapsed failed state was initially Somalia, which for many years fell into the state of nature described by Thomas Hobbes as a war against all, a war of all against all. And in Somalia, millions of casualties took place. The country became a base of operations for international terrorist organizations, and it triggered immense and extensive refugee movements that undermined the stability of its neighbors. And dysfunctional statehood contributes to many of today's global problems. It complicates the search for solutions and seriously hampers implementation of international agreements. And when it comes to failing or failed states, diplomats have the problem that we don't have any acknowledged interlocutors to talk to. There's an international think tank called the Peace for Fund for Peace, who once a year publishes the list of failed states. And currently among the 10 worst failed states, there are 8 African states, plus Afghanistan and Syria. So the most failed state right now is Yemen, followed by Somalia, which has been on the list for more than 20 years. And I think third in place now is South Sudan. Another important development that challenges the international order, and is pretty new, is cybercrime. We talk about cyber wars, which target the destruction of critical infrastructure, supply of energy, water, health, food, or key functions of administration, like finance and communication. And the consequences of cyber wars can be more devastating to people than classic wars. Under international public law, cyber wars are considered now acts of violence. And the question for diplomacy is how far familiar rules of international law, namely the prohibition of force on the one hand and the right to self-defense on the other hand, can be applied to cyberspace and cyber wars. Another feature of international order, or rather disorder, is increasingly hybrid warfare. We are talking about the so-called new wars. And hybrid wars include the fact that, first, it is no longer possible to distinguish between state and non-state actors. Usually wars were between states and the armies, but now many more actors are involved. And hybrid wars feature an often quite opaque coexistence and antagonism between state armies, paramilitary units, police, rebel groups, warlords, mercenary forces, terrorist groups, and of course, common criminals. The second feature of hybrid wars is that there is an increasing hardening and brutalization of conflict, in which the boundaries between civilians and combatants have been erased, and abuses against civilians, for instance, ethnic cleansing, mass rape, mutilation, looting, policy of scorched earth, have become a common means of conducting conflict. And then third, hybrid wars frequently feature shifting wartime alliances, which in turn necessitate constant changes of allegiance to ensure survival while generating high levels of insecurity and stress. And diplomatic efforts to restore and to preserve peace are substantially hampered by these new wars, in addition to the fact of failing and failed states. And above all these developments, of course, lies, as we all know, the process of globalization. So the growing interdependence of the world economies, cultures, populations, brought about by cross-border trade in goods, services, technology, flows of investment, people, and, most important, information. Last aspects, I think we cannot talk about challenges to the international order without mentioning the word corona, because the COVID-19 pandemic is the third globally perceptible shock of the still young 21st century. The first one were the terrorist attacks in September 2001, and then the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, and now COVID-19. And it's been described as the most severe shock because its reach is truly global, directly affecting people in almost every country in the world, without exception, albeit to varying degrees. And the rapid spread of the coronavirus has illustrated how quickly the priorities and the norms of nation states and the international community can be upended, and has thrown our interconnectedness into stark relief. I think it's still too early to make definite statements about the impact of COVID-19 on international politics, but I think we can assume with a very high degree of certainty that the pandemic and its consequences will continue to shape international relations, the level of international cooperation, and internal development of very many countries. For the time being, even after effective vaccines have been developed and the disease has been brought under control. So it is these developments that have mainly led to the talk of a world of disorder. But what this international order or disorder means for diplomacy is now subject of my following remarks. And I first want to look with you at the classic tasks of diplomacy and then ask what challenges it is undergoing. As far as the classic tasks of diplomats are concerned, I can, of course, refer to my own professional experience. So what do diplomats traditionally do? First of all, they represent their home countries abroad. They inform their host countries about important developments and positions at home and strive to maintain a good reputation for their home country. Second, diplomats negotiate bilaterally or multilaterally to advance or to defend national interests and to influence the decisions and behaviors of foreign governments and peoples. Third, diplomats establish and manage interpersonal networks, ties, relationships, and interactions with key people. With key people in their host countries. And fourth, diplomats gather information on political, economic, social developments in the host countries, analyze them, and inform the governments accordingly. The fifth task is that we provide consular services, for example, assistance to compatriots or visas for nationals of the host country. Sixth point, we try to initiate or promote projects that serve to deepen bilateral relations in the fields of politics, economics, culture, science, etc. And seventh, diplomats are active in the fields of conflict prevention and conflict resolution. The purpose of diplomacy is to strengthen the state, nation, or organization it serves in relation to others by advancing the interests in its charge. And even in time of peace, diplomacy might involve coercive threats of economic or other punitive measures or demonstration of the capability to impose unilateral solutions to disputes by application of military power. But normally, diplomacy seeks to develop goodwill towards the state it represents, nurturing relations with foreign states and peoples that will ensure their cooperation or, failing that, their neutrality. The main weapons of diplomacy are words, backed by the power of the state or organization they represent. In order to succeed in these fields, diplomats are attributed special character traits or skills, including moral integrity, truthfulness, precision, calm, good temper, patience, modesty, loyalty, intelligence, tact, the skill of human engagement, cultural knowledge, and very important, empathy, meaning the attempt to understand the thoughts, feelings, and experiences of the interlocutors or host countries, viewing the world through their eyes by taking into account the history, identity, and the socio-economic and political backdrop. And critical to this is the importance of self-reflection. And in a diplomatic context, that means awareness of how the words, deeds, behaviors, and past policies of the country or community you represent as a diplomat have an impact how another person or society may perceive your actions. So the listed characteristics or character traits of course describe a wish list, and the diplomatic skills one has vary from diplomat to diplomat, and whoever possesses them all is of course more of a saint than a diplomat. But it helps in the profession if one makes an effort to strive for these skills and apply them. So now finally, let's look at the future of diplomacy against the backdrop of the current international order and its challenges. The first thing to note is that the traditional tasks of diplomacy that I've listed, as well as the professional skills that a diplomat should possess, they continue, they persist also under the current conditions of the international order. Yeah, but there are new challenges to the art of diplomacy, and some of which dramatically change the way how diplomatic key functions are now being conducted. Yeah, the fact that diplomats for centuries or decades represented venerable principles, yeah, in former times powerful monarchs, kings, and tsars, yeah, to establish states. These facts guaranteed diplomats a protected and privileged status, yeah, for many, many centuries. Yeah, but nowadays, the public perceptions of diplomats have changed dramatically. Yeah, and this to the extent that diplomats are now seen as symbols of disfavored countries or religions. Yeah, and the basic principle of diplomatic immunity no longer applies to them. And rather, the representative function has become a justification for political violence. Yeah, for instance, the assassination of the Russian ambassador to Turkey a couple of years ago is a very prominent example for this. Yeah, and instead of being untouchable, diplomats have now increasingly become highly endangered symbols. Another very important change comes from the multitude of stakeholders. Yeah, when we worked during Cold War times, yeah, it offered us diplomats and also the politicians a sense of certainty, yeah, about how the world worked, yeah, where the power resided, and who was a friend or adversary. And today's diplomacy operates in a world of multiple actors, diverse threats, and competing considerations. Yeah, when I began my diplomatic career in 1990, yeah, diplomatic relations were still very much intergovernmental. Yeah, and this has changed dramatically, yeah, due to the multitude of actors influencing the shaping of foreign policy and international relations. Diplomatic action has also had to diversify considerably. Yeah, diplomacy today is no longer merely intergovernmental, but must interact with all those who try to exert influence in the international arena. Yeah, today we talk and negotiate not only with other state representatives, but with business representatives, civil society, religious leaders, and many, many others. Yeah, and at the same time, the multipolar world is characterized by constantly changing and fluid alliances. Yeah, in the decade of the Cold War, yeah, as a diplomat, you usually knew who was an ally and who was an adversary. And today's all these camps are in flux, and who is an ally or adversary depends many often on the issue. Yeah, this means that depending on whether I want to promote, let's say, climate change, yeah, or gender issues, migration management, the fight against international terrorism, trade issues, or the conflict in Syria are on the agenda, diplomacy each time has to look for different allies and forge shifting alliances. Yeah, sometimes when we discuss these issues, we find ourselves in one camp with Russia. Sometimes we find ourselves in opposite camps. And the same is true of our relationship with the United States, with China, with African or Latin American countries, or even with our close partners within the European Union. Yeah, and these necessities for changing constellations naturally have a major impact on day-to-day diplomacy. Yeah, it requires from us a constant reaching out to juggle different partners and issues. Yeah, and to describe these new realities, the term multi-stakeholder diplomacy is now used. Yeah, and the logic of multi-stakeholder diplomacy image resides in the limitations confronted by all actors, both state and non-state, in achieving their policy objectives. So consequently, diplomacy is becoming more a networking mode of activity and much less hierarchical in both its structures and processes like in the past 40 years. Another very important driver of change for diplomacy lies with all the new technologies and means of communication. As we all know, traditional distances of space and time have been bridged now, and this change makes connections between diplomatic and public actors both more immediate and more instantaneous. We can say that social media has democratized diplomacy, given access for leaders to have more direct contact with their populations. And platforms such as Twitter or Facebook can be used to galvanize actions and mobilize people to support certain initiatives or also to discredit diplomatic efforts even before they reach fruition. Social media can be used by governments to exacerbate divides and to stoke popular public sentiments against other countries. And it also makes it easier for public leaders to engage with foreign audiences to build support for changes in relations between states. Just think about the Twitter diplomacy by President Trump, who had millions of followers and were talking to the whole world. Some people said he was only twittering during the 4 years of his tenure. And at the same time, non-governmental actors, protest groups, global causes have significant power to harness emotional forces, mobilize populations, and shape the agendas of states and international organizations. And here the most prominent example, recent example is the Swedish girl, Greta Thunberg, the figurehead of all these climate change initiatives. A young Swedish girl who succeeded to galvanize global anger for change and help shape international norms and expectation for the conduct and politics of officials, both many government leaders and even the United Nations. Another aspect that poses new and problematic challenges to diplomacy is the rapid increase in the speed of information transmission, which has significantly shortened the time required to respond to an international crisis or event. We experience what is happening in geographically distant parts of the world, so to speak, in real time, because of the often simultaneous transmission of information. And this results in an increasing burden on the people acting both at the top of the hierarchies and where the decision-making proposals are worked out. That is on the diplomatic sphere. The time span between receiving information, deliberating on the event, and deciding on a response is becoming shorter and shorter and shorter. And this increases for politicians and diplomats the risk that wrong decisions will be made. Not through mistakes by understanding known facts, but through an insufficient time budget for the reflection on facts and options for action. But it's not only the new speed of information transfer that is a problem, it is also the new abundance of information. It is really appropriate to speak of a flood of information that we're facing today in the internet. When I joined the international service, the diplomatic service in 1990, there were no workplace computers, no internet, no emails, and reports we received were usually sent by diplomatic courier once a week. And today, every day as you probably as well, I have hundreds of emails in my inbox every day. At the same time, I have to sift through all the relevant information circulating on the internet. yeah, and much of which increasingly falls into the category of fake news. Yeah, so diplomacy therefore must now distill information in a useful way with a high level of competence rather than just collecting it. Yeah, the focus today in diplomacy is not reporting about any events, yeah, like we did 30 years ago. Yeah, the focus is now on the question why something happened and under which circumstances. Yeah, looking at the motives and not at the event itself. One of the most drastic effects on the very nature of diplomacy comes from what is called the multiplication of publics in modern states. Yeah, and this is due to the fact that our living environments, yeah, our professional worlds, yeah, education, interests, experiences, ideological orientations, yeah, they are becoming more and more diverse. Yeah, and therefore in diplomacy we have to deal with more and more different publics coexisting with each other at the same time. And government action, at least in democracies, is now subject to ongoing observation and comment by the public and social media. So whatever a president says and publishes in the social media immediately gets a lot of attention, a lot of comments, likes, or thumbs down. So the dialogue has dramatically increased. And inevitably, therefore, modern diplomats face a pressure also to use social media, be responsive, and thus more vulnerable to attacks by the public. A serious risk associated with the use of social media in diplomacy lies in the changes it entails in public thinking about foreign policy. Public engagement in foreign policy issue has increased. This is in principle a very good thing. But when people engage in foreign policy, mostly it manifests itself in opposition to government actions and not in support for them. And when the public opposes government action, it is typically limited to a single issue, and therefore often overlooks the nuances required in the diplomatic management of multiple priorities through interaction with numerous states. Put simply, the public often tends to oversimplify foreign policy and often reacting disproportionately to seemingly black and white ethical or moral questions. And that puts a lot of pressure on politicians and diplomats alike. And the burden we are faced with as a consequence of this is we are always called upon to invest more time in strategic thinking. But strategic thinking, due to all the time pressures, is often reduced to what is called instant diplomacy. And we see many politicians who measure success not in regards to the final results of their actions, but rather in regards to the number of likes or followers they harvest on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. So I would like to conclude my remarks by mentioning one policy decision that my government, so Germany, has taken in response to the so-called challenges of the international order. Germany, together with France, has launched the so-called Alliance for Multilateralism. Multilateralism refers on the one hand to a particular approach to foreign policy action. And in this respect, multilateralism simply means the coordinated diplomatic interaction of 3 or more states in international politics, in contrast to bilateral or unilateral action. But this understanding of multilateralism is a purely formal category. Yeah, it is about the conduct rather than the substance and the goals of international politics. And we, German foreign policy, uses the concept of multilateralism with a more ample and exigent interpretation. Yeah? In our version, multilateral foreign policy stands not only for the specific diplomatic approach, but also for a commitment to certain principles, substantive goals and methods of foreign policy, and for an underlying set of values. We are looking for like-minded partners with regards to certain international values. And the goal is to conduct international relations not in terms of zero-sum gains, but to turn them into win-win situations for all actors involved. It implies the notion that globalization should not be reduced to finance or economies or communication, but that it should also include the globalization of solidarity and empathy. And the Corona crisis is certainly a very good example that highlights the importance of such an alliance for multilateralism. Thanks a lot for your attention. I hope I spoke clearly enough and that it was not too difficult. Thanks again.
Thank you, sir. Now it's time for questions. Пожалуйста, коллеги, вопросы. Well, while our guests and our students are thinking, may I have the first question? Oh, already. Okay, please. Если можно, называйте себя, пожалуйста, хорошо?
Oh, there we go. So my name is Konstantin Solomykin. Herr Finke, first of all, thank you for visiting us and holding this lecture. And with your permission, I will read my question from my device. So, I'm curious to know your vision of Russian-German interactions in Syria in the forthcoming years, and how the factor of Syrian refugees who in the quite near future will acquire German citizenship will affect these interactions. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to German-Russian relations, I think we are facing the most severe challenges for, I would even say, for the past 60 or 70 years. It started, I think, with the early wars after the Cold War come down. We had the great chance to talk about a pan-European international order of peace and stability as outlined in the OSCE Charter of Paris in 1990. There was a lot of enthusiasm. Everybody talked about a new peace order. President Gorbachev at that time, President Bush, a lot of euphoria. There was talk about the end of history, and we missed that opportunity. I think it had to do with a long set of misperceptions. It started also with the offer at that time of the European Union and NATO concerning enlargement to members of the former Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And then, of course, from a German perspective or European perspective, the climax was what we call the illegal annexation of the Crimea in 2014, the conflict in Ukraine. Now there's a lot of talk about human rights in Russia, and the focus is on the Navalny affair and so on and so on. And I think that our relations on a political level have never been so problematic as they are right now. And the problem for diplomats is that we now talk more about each other than we talk to each other. We highlight tensions, we highlight divisions, we highlight all the factors that divide us, and we are not looking for common ground. And right now I don't see any face-saving approach, which is very important in international politics, to get out of this problematic situation. As far as Siberia is concerned, that is another issue of contention, with Russia backing the regime of Assad. We are very much opposed to that, and we still have no found common strategy, neither on a bilateral level, nor on a multilateral level within the Security Council of the United Nations and other fora. And of course, we in Europe, we are have been faced with the migration crisis. Most of them right now come from the Middle East, not only Syria, Iraq as well, Yemen. It depends on the migration flows. And of course, at first there was in Germany what we call the culture of welcome. Also from our historic responsibility to protect human rights, there was a great willingness to help those who had to fear for their lives. But the problem is that we have taken too many at the same time. Within a couple of months, more than 1.5 million new refugees, which overburdened the social and other systems in Germany. And all these people who came to Germany, there's of course the issue and the challenge of integration. And we in Germany, we have not found a consensus what integration should mean. Does it mean that the Syrians become Germans in the long way? Does it mean a peaceful coexistence? What about the issue of religion? And so on and so on. And we have not yet reached a final decision. But there's still the overwhelming part of the German population in favor of helping those who really need help. But at the same time, more and more appeals to politicians to define an immigration law which sets clear quotas, which also defines more clearly our national interest. You can define migration flows in terms of economic interest, saying, okay, we need, 100,000 new migrants every year, for the German labor market. And then you set another quota of 100,000 for family reunions and another quota for people who seek for political asylum, for instance. But we have not reached that decision yet. And above all, these questions are not only being discussed with Germany themselves, but many of that now fall under the competence of the European Union, asylum law, for instance. So we have to find an agreement not only internally in Germany, but with all the other 26 member states of the European Union as well, with all their different historic, cultural, economic backgrounds. This is a very difficult task.
Пожалуйста, вопросы. Микрофон, пожалуйста.
Mr. Finke, I'm glad to meet you again. You seem to have become a regular visitor to our university.
I hope that doesn't change after today. So.
And I'd like to pose a very academic question. You're totally right when saying we're facing an international disorder, but my academic question is, wasn't it diplomacy that bears responsibility for this international disorder? So wasn't it public diplomacy who failed to create a new international order after the collapse of Soviet Union and the end of East-West conflict? I mean, it was German General Klaus von Clausewitz who once said, the war is merely nothing else than an extension of diplomacy by other means. And my question is, whether we still need the old diplomacy who steps in old pattern, or we should rather arrange an international assembly to rethink the very concept of diplomacy. You know that diplomatic activities, they lead exactly to the failed states you mentioned. We think on Iraq, Libya, and Syria, where once we had the order and now there are failed states and a real good cause for migration and refugees coming to Europe and other states. And we think on all the espionage activities that are undertaken under diplomatic cover by foreign states and other means of interfering in internal affairs of other states. Mm-hmm. Do we still need the old diplomacy?
I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, of course, when we look at a couple of the issues I mentioned, yeah, who are now exemplifying what we call the world out of joint or disorder, yeah, it has strongly to do with the failure of international politics and diplomacy to set the rules that would have prevented the disorder to happen. Yeah, and the question of failing and failed states, yeah, is on top of the list. Hybrid wars is on top of the list again. Yeah, we have been discussions in the United Nations, the main fora for international dialogue and for shaping the international order now for 2 decades, yeah, about necessary and relevant reforms. Yeah, and one commission after another is dealing with these issues, or the diplomats sitting around the corner. But the main fora is the Security Council. Yeah. And of course, I think we all agree that the Security Council in its current composition, yeah, with Russia, China, the United States, France, and Great Britain as permanent members with a veto right, yeah, they represent the old order and not the current order. Yeah, but there is no consensus right now in the United Nations to change that. Why? Because the permanent 5 members have no interest in real reforms, because it would weaken their status. Yeah, when we talk to our closest allies, yeah, France or the United States or Great Britain, everybody is nodding when we say we have to change the composition of the Security Council. Yeah, we need representatives from Africa, Latin America, more Asian countries, from a German perspective, Germany as well, as one of the main contributors. Everybody's nodding, yeah, but behind the scenes, yeah, we don't get a lot of support. Yeah, because if we would change the composition of the P5, yeah, to P10 or P15, the P5 would lose status and power and influence. And none of the P5 is interested in that. Yeah, so you are right. Yeah, there's a high degree of responsibility from the states and the representatives, diplomats as well. But many other factors came on top of that, where we had no real influence. Yeah. Internet and its many impacts on how international diplomacy and international conduct is being shaped. Yeah, the increasing power of multinational companies, yeah, not only Google, many others. Yeah. And of course, the increasing also assertiveness, yeah, of non-governmental organizations, yeah, especially in the field of human rights, yeah, Amnesty International, yeah, Human Rights Watch, and in the field of climate change and environmental policy. Yeah, so we now have just to deal with even more actors, yeah, and on top of the problems we are creating ourselves, we have to deal with all the external problems I mentioned. Yeah, and all the academic exchange and research on the future of diplomacy is dealing with these issues. Yeah, there's now a special group created by the Harvard University in the United States, yeah, an expert panel of elder statesmen, and university professors, and current professionals, yeah, who tries to come to terms with the challenges you mentioned in your question.
Thank you. Вопросы еще?
Thank you. First of all, sorry for my not very good English, да? Что, включить? First of all, thank you and sorry for my not very good in English. What do you think about the construction of Nord Stream 2 and the United States opinion about it? That's all.
Well, the position of my government is quite clear. Yeah, we want a project to be implemented. Yeah, the opposition, which comes from the United States, has begun, of course, under President Trump. I think for two reasons. Yeah, one, of course, has to do with the relations between the United States and Russia. But also, of course, the opposition is a result of the economic interests of the United States to sell their gas and their oil to Europe. Yeah, we hope that the project will be implemented. Right now, we are facing quite the ironic situation that, for instance, the European Union has imposed sanctions on Russia for all the problems I've listed. And at the same time, we are now subject to sanctions from the United States because of our support to Nord Stream 2. So it's quite a complicated situation. But my government hopes that we can implement it. But there's a lot of support, a lot of pressure, not only from the United States, also from our allies in NATO and the European Union, Poland, for instance, who oppose to the project.
Пожалуйста, еще вопросы?
Herr
In which conflict, excuse me? Middle? The Middle East conflict, or? Well, our Syria policy is guided by two interests. First of all, to stop the killing and the fighting. And then, of course, by the internal hope that the migration flows will be reduced. Syria is mainly being discussed in the framework of the Security Council, to which we are no longer a member. We offer our good services as a member of the European Union. We still have not come to terms with the question, can we deal with a political leader who is killing his own people, like Assad is doing, with gas attacks, chemical welfare, and so on and so on. I must admit, I would say that we are a bit clueless. The war is going on now for many, many years. And the risk is a bit like Somalia, that it will be overshadowed by other crises, and that we forget about the plight of the people suffering in Syria and neighboring states. We must not forget that Syria is not only a problem for Syria, but for the whole region. If you look at the burden the refugee crisis poses on countries like Turkey, Lebanon, and so on, it's really global dimensions it has. But we don't have a blueprint how to solve the problem and the crisis. We are trying to support the opposition, bringing people together. And to a certain degree, of course, we have to acknowledge the fact that if Assad does not leave the scene, we have to engage with him to a certain degree. The same as we did before in Sudan with, what was his name, Bashir? With Bashir and others. Sometimes we just cannot choose the leaders or make them the way we like them.
Thank you. Коллеги, просьба себя называть, хотя бы какой факультет, хорошо?
Okay. Philippine Faculty of History and Political... Really? Faculty of Political Science and History. My question is about international organization and what is the place of international non-governmental organization in the contemporary situation in the world of disorder? Thank you very much.
Well, non-governmental organizations, and international. Well, international organizations, like which we define under public international law, like the United Nations and its many sub-organizations, the African Union, European Union, and so on. They are a legitimate player and recognized by the international order. When we talk about international disorder, it does not mean that non-governmental organizations contribute to disorder. It only means that we are faced now with much more actors than we were faced before. Many non-governmental organizations, their main goal is they are lobbying for their interests. They are lobbying diplomats, governments, they are lobbying the public, they are lobbying the media, and they, of course, they are lobbying international organizations. So all important non-governmental organizations have offices, for instance, in New York or in Geneva, and the centers of the United Nations, and they're in a constant dialogue with diplomats who work for these organizations, trying to convince them to take certain actions. Some international organizations already in their statutes, which they reformed, foresee an integral part for non-governmental organizations to be heard and consulted. The most prominent example for that is the Human Rights Council in Geneva. So, for instance, when one country has to present before the members of the Human Rights Council their domestic human rights situations, non-governmental organizations have a right to ask questions, to make comments, to present shadow reports. So their role in the international order is already institutionalized. And it will not disappear. I think it will even increase and increase and increase. The more powerful and the more active they are, and the more successful in engaging the public, to favor their own goals. For instance, many non-governmental organizations forged a close alliance with Greta Thunberg in advancing climate change. And together they were in a position to change governmental behavior and positions. So it's in flux, but it will not diminish. It will become more and more important, and will be an institutional element in the international order.
Develop this question a little bit further. The organization that you probably have in mind are mostly with their roots or origins in the West and Western culture, liberal, open, democratic, and so on. But what we see now is the rise of the East, China and the Southeast Asia countries, and to some extent the Middle East, especially the Saudi Arabia and those countries. But these are not that friendly to the order that created non-governmental organizations. So if the East is rising, does it mean that NGOs are coming there also, or they are developing their own NGOs, or perhaps the NGOs' role is diminishing or going to be diminishing in the nearest future because of the threat of the East?
When we talk about the role of non-governmental organizations with a view to the elements you mentioned, yeah, that they are in many countries not well liked, yeah, I think we have to differentiate between political importance and the space to maneuver. Yeah, what we call the space to maneuver, yeah, it is of course shrinking. Yeah, because many countries are taking now decisive actions against the works of non-governmental organizations. Yeah, not only in China or Saudi Arabia, we also can see it from a German perspective here in Russia. Yeah, with new legislation on foreign agents and so on, limiting the possibilities of cooperation between international non-governmental organizations with Russian partners here. Yeah, so yes, yeah. We also have to look at what is at stake. Yeah. I think when we talk about issues where there's general agreement that they are of general concern, health issue, climate change in certain degrees, I think non-governmental organizations can also play a role in these countries. Yeah, the hot potato, so to speak, is always when we talk about human rights. Because in these countries are shouting after a couple of minutes, this is interference into our domestic affairs. Yeah. And then of course they try to limit or even prohibit the workings of non-governmental organizations in their respective territories. Yeah. This is one of another very pressing issue in international politics, what we call human rights relativism. Yeah, whoever you talk to, yeah, China, even North Korea, and others countries who are not too well known for a good human rights record, everybody says yes to human rights. Yeah, you don't find anybody, yeah, who says no to human rights. But the question is that many times the yes is added by a but. Yes, but. Yeah, yes, we have signed all the international conventions, like Russia did, but yeah, we cannot allow the human right to freedom of expression to destabilize our societies. Yes, we agree to human rights, but our traditional values are more important than human rights invented by the West. Yes, we agree to human rights, but we have to make concessions in order not to lose jobs when we are engaging into trade with China. Yes, we have signed the International Convention to prohibit torture, but when it comes to fight international terrorism, we have to reconsider. So there are many who try to undermine both the two fundamental principles of human rights. It's universality and inalienability. And I think this is a major challenge to all of us.
У меня, коллеги, вопрос к организаторам. У нас еще есть время или сколько времени у нас?
Ich hab,
10 minutes. Ага. Коллеги, тогда еще вопросы можно задавать, пожалуйста.
Mr. Finke, since a week, an international community has been observing the current developments on the Gaza Strip.
On the?
Gaza Strip. The current developments on Gaza Strip.
Yeah.
And we know that German Chief Diplomat Heiko Maas has just proposed the so-called three steps plan for the resolution of the Middle East conflict. So could you please stipulate this plan for our students?
No, not yet. I'm not familiar with all the details of the plan.
What is the basic German position to the Israel-Palestinian conflict?
Well, the basic
German two states.
The basic German position is again the European position, a two-state resolution. a solution for the Middle East. We are trying to push that. There are a couple of resolutions also in the framework of the Security Council. Israel in some regards is not observing them. We have the constant issue of attacks by Arabian forces on Israel, like now by Hamas, and so on. It's a quagmire, and I don't know how many international plans currently exist to solve the Middle East problem, which is on the table now for, I don't know, 80 years, something like that. So I think it's another topic where we are more or less clueless. We have, as it seems, not enough resources of power to bring both Israel and the Palestinians to find a common solution. And then, of course, we have varying interests of other regional players, not to mention Saudi Arabia or Iran, who are definitely have a hidden agenda when it comes to supporting those who are in opposition to a lasting solution. My guess is, without knowing the plan of my minister in detail, that's probably not containing a long list of new elements, but bringing together a couple of proposals which had been on the table now for a couple of years.
With a statement that German historical responsibility in front of the Jews has any influence on the German policy towards Israel and Israel-Arabic conflict?
The German history is the main factor which shapes our relations to Israel. Nevertheless, we are in favor of a two-state solution. But of course, we have a very intense discussion in Germany if Germans are allowed to criticize Israel, for instance, for human rights violations. Some say, of course, we even have a special responsibility. Because if we criticize human rights violations by the Arab states and not obvious human rights violations by Israel, it's just another example of a policy of double standards. But of course we have a special responsibility. And the security of Israel and the survival of Israel in a very hostile environment is of our one of our top concerns.
Пожалуйста, еще вопросы? Well, may I put another question? The father of 5100 project, Andrei Volkov, once described the contemporary businessman or CEO portrait. This person has to be able to have a night flight, look sharp in the morning, and have 8 to 12 hours focused negotiations, reaching the result his company wants in the end. So what are the features contemporary diplomat has to have if we are talking about the routine? I mean, daily activities, all the things that are maybe technical, but essential for diplomat to function properly, to solve his tasks, to be operating, and to achieve results.
Well, it of course depends in which diplomatic context you are working. The tasks and the daily responsibilities of a diplomat who works for the Consul General Consulate General in Novosibirsk are completely different from my colleagues who work now for the German embassy in Moscow, or those who work for the United Nations in New York. My colleagues in Moscow right now, they are mostly occupied with the tensions and the conflicts which shape relations between Russia and Germany and Russia and the European Union. So there's a lot of discussion about Crimea and Navalny and human rights and the foreign agent law. These issues are of no concern for our work here in Novosibirsk, in Siberia, in Tomsk. Nobody is really interested here in these issues. People I talk to, they are interested in cooperation, in dialogue, in exchange programs, in studying in Germany, for instance. So I deal with completely different issues. I think the most important factor is to decide on posteriorities. We have so many things on our table at the same time, and deciding within a couple of minutes what is important today and what can wait another day or a week or is not important at all. This is something which we have to do every morning. And then, of course, what remains very important are all the characteristics which are now described by the term intercultural competence. So empathy. I think my task, or one of my tasks, is to explain to my government in Berlin and Brussels what is Siberia about. What are the priorities of people here? What is the younger generation thinking? You, for instance. What questions do I get into a discussion about the international relations? And in order to portray an adequate picture of what's going on here in the country, I need a minimum of sympathy for you. The willingness to understand what are your views. I do not and I cannot impose my perceptions on you. When I talk to you, I want to understand what is your worldview. And this flows into the reports I send to Berlin. So empathy is very important, setting of priorities, and even more important, posteriorities. So everything which is connected with intercultural competence. It's a new word. I don't know how long it exists, 20 years, 25 years. But it's something which diplomats, or is part of diplomatic life and diplomatic characteristics since the beginning of diplomacy.
Коллеги, один последний вопрос, если есть, и все. Нет вопросов. Тогда поблагодарим Гера Финке